was the year I turned 18. I moved to New Jersey and started college here. Me, along with two of my friends, James and Ethan, rented a house and lived together. We stayed in a small house located in a peaceful and friendly suburban neighborhood in New Jersey. Aunt May, the owner of the house, was very kind to us. We each had separate rooms. James had a bedroom on the ground floor, as did Ethan. I, on the other hand, stayed in a room in the attic. I loved that room because of the privacy and comfort it provided. At that time, James and I were big fans of Halloween and the fall season in general. Every year, we would attend the Halloween festival organized by the school or go to Halloween parties held by our classmates. But this year, we just wanted to stay home and relax instead of going to those parties. That year, Halloween fell on a Friday, and we decided to stay home, watch some horror movies in my room in the attic, and just chill together. After watching a few movies, we started feeling bored. It was around midnight, and most of the kids had already gone home after trick-or-treating. Since the next day was Saturday, and we didn't have to go to school, James and I decided to go out for a walk and buy some snacks. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed back to keep an eye on the house. We started walking around the quiet, empty neighborhood. After stopping by a convenience store to buy a few packs of cigarettes and some snacks, we headed to a park that we usually visited almost every day. When we arrived near the park, since the main gate was locked at night, we decided to take the small path behind the park, where trees shaded the area, creating a dark and eerie atmosphere. Near the entrance were a few soccer fields and a picnic area, so we felt a bit more at ease. As we walked into the path behind the park under the dim streetlight, we suddenly stopped. Both of us noticed a man lying motionless on a bench. I called out, "Hey!" but there was no response. An uneasy feeling crept up on me. I suggested that we should go back home immediately, but James insisted on getting closer to check it out, which was strange since I was usually the braver one between the two of us. As we got closer, we confirmed that it was indeed a man. He was lying there still, with a coat covering his body. Trying not to panic, we slowly backed away, intending to turn back home without confronting him. But before we could move, another sound came from both sides of us. In the darkness, we saw two more figures approaching from each side. Unlike the first man, these two were moving towards us. Fear surged through me, my stomach tightening.
Run!
Without hesitation, we turned and sprinted out of the park, running straight back home and locking the door behind us. We dashed up to the attic, which was my room. Usually, I felt a strong sense of security whenever I returned to my room. But this time, I didn't. There was an overwhelming sense of unease, sitting in the attic with all the lights off. We anxiously kept looking out the window to see if anyone was watching or had followed us home. Both of us were too scared to know what to do next. After a while, Ethan woke up and came to ask us what had happened. After hearing the story, he was also very confused and didn't know what to do either. Were we really safe right now, or was it just someone trying to mess with us? Half an hour passed, and it seemed like everything was fine. There was no one watching outside. We felt a bit more at ease. We decided to close the door and pop open a few bottles of beer, starting a small party on Halloween night. Around 2:30 a.m., when we were slightly drunk and chatting about random things, suddenly a noise came from outside the kitchen window. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just a few rats. But when James went into the kitchen to check and pulled up the curtain, we were all completely creeped out. The pumpkin was lying in our backyard. This made us uneasy because we hadn't put up any Halloween decorations, and we certainly hadn't grown any pumpkins. This was the second time that night that we felt scared, and we quickly retreated back to the living room. At that moment, the fear sobered us up completely. The three of us were huddled together on the sofa, trying not to look outside the window. Our living room had no curtains, making it impossible for us not to glance out there. In a quick look out the window, we saw them. The three men that James and I had seen at the park were standing in the middle of the road, just standing there and staring directly at our house. We thought about calling the police, but then asked ourselves, what would we say to them? There are three strange men standing in front of my house, or they disturbed us in the middle of the night by throwing a pumpkin into our yard. At that moment, the three of us were utterly panicked and didn't know what to do. We just huddled together on the sofa, trying to focus on the sports show on TV to distract ourselves, clutching the empty beer bottles for some semblance of security. About 15 minutes later, we looked out the window again, and the three men had disappeared. The streetlights had also gone out, leaving only darkness outside. The entire night, we sat in the living room watching TV until we eventually dozed off. Morning finally arrived. We woke up early, even though it was Saturday. The three of us called Aunt May and told her about what had happened the previous night. Aunt May comforted us and said it was probably just some pranksters in the neighborhood trying to mess with us on Halloween night. We felt somewhat relieved because Aunt May had lived here for many years before renting the house to us. By the afternoon, we decided to go on a trip somewhere far away for the weekend to forget about the bizarre events of the night before. However, just as I opened the door, a note stuck to the door fell to the ground. It was a piece of paper with some scribbled writing that read, "Happy Halloween," along with a smiley face. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a greeting from a neighbor. But no. Upon closer inspection, we were utterly horrified by the small lines at the bottom. "P.S. Good thing you guys locked the door tightly." This sent a chill down our spines, making us feel the same fear as we had felt a few hours earlier, thinking we were in real danger. We cancelled our weekend trip and stayed inside the house for the rest of the weekend. Since then, every Halloween, I still wonder what would have happened if we hadn't locked the door, or if we had decided to confront them that night. It may have been a peaceful little neighborhood, but on Halloween night, anything can happen. That autumn, I experienced a terrifying Halloween night that I still can't forget to this day. This is a story that happened many years ago, when I was still living in a small village, deep in the rural areas of northern Georgia. I've shared this story with my family and close friends, but no one believed me. They thought I was just making up a ghost story to scare everyone, but I know what I saw and felt that night was real. Back then, I lived with my family in a small house near the end of the village. It was a small, remote village with only a few households, but everyone knew each other and stayed closely connected. The village always had a quiet and somewhat eerie atmosphere, especially at night when only a few dim streetlights faintly illuminated the roads. The stillness was unsettling, and I always found myself walking a little faster when the sun set, hoping to get home before the creeping shadows swallowed up the path completely. At the beginning of the village, there was an old, abandoned house that had been empty for a long time. It used to belong to old William, the village elder, who had passed away about 10 years ago. Since old William passed away, the house gradually fell into disrepair. Weeds grew throughout the garden, and ivy crept up, covering the faded walls, making it look like a giant skeleton hidden beneath layers of vines. Most of the villagers avoided going near it, even during the day, fearing the strange energy that seemed to radiate from within. People in the village spoke of old William with a mix of respect and regret. He was once the pillar of the community, leading and protecting the village through many difficult times. It was said that he was always present, always watching, guiding the villagers in subtle ways. Yet, his death was shrouded in mystery. One night, he'd just vanished. They found his body at the bottom of a steep ravine a few miles outside the village, his cane lying beside him. It was a gruesome scene, and nobody could understand how or why he ended up there. Since that night, rumors spread that old William's spirit remained, not yet at peace, still lingering in his old home, watching over the village, or perhaps watching for something else. That Halloween night, me, along with a few friends, decided to go trick-or-treating around the village. Halloween in the countryside wasn't as lively as in the city, but for us, it was a special night when the kids could dress up as their favorite characters and collect as much candy as possible from our neighbors. Even if the village was small, we'd make a game out of it, seeing who could fill their bags the most by the end of the night. At that time, I was around 15 years old, dressed in a homemade superhero costume, while my friends, Jacob, Mike, and Hannah, each wore different spooky outfits. Jacob had dressed up as a classic zombie, with fake blood dripping down his face. Mike was a vampire, his plastic fangs making him lisp every time he spoke. And Hannah, who always wanted to stand out, was dressed as a sinister-looking witch. We went from house to house, collecting colorful candies, laughing and teasing each other. But as the night went on and our bags grew heavier, the conversation shifted.
We're almost out of houses to visit,
Mike said, glancing at the handful of lit-up windows left in the village.
Maybe it's time we go somewhere different?
Hannah suggested, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper.
How about old William's house?
No way!
Jacob said instantly, shaking his head.
That place is off limits. Everyone says it's haunted.
Exactly.
Hannah's eyes gleamed mischievously.
Which means no one else would dare go there. If we do, we'll be the only ones brave enough to say we did it.
Despite the uneasy feeling building in my gut, Hannah's challenge made me pause. Mike and I exchanged looks, and then, against better judgment, we both nodded. The curiosity and excitement of breaking a rule was too tempting to resist. We all wanted to prove ourselves, to become legends in the village for daring to face what everyone else feared. The whole group decided to head to old William's abandoned house, even if it was just to stand at the gate, knock on the door, and run away. We made our way through the village, the sound of our footsteps growing softer as we approached the shadowy outline of the old house. The closer we got, the quieter we became, each of us glancing nervously at the others. The pale moonlight shone on the decaying walls, making the place look like a giant ghost lurking in the shadows. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of rustling leaves in the wind and our footsteps softly echoing on the narrow path. The iron gate, though old and rusted, swung open silently when Hannah pushed it. We cautiously stepped through, every sense on high alert. Everything was covered in dust and overgrown vines, as if the place had been forgotten for decades. The front yard was a mess of tangled weeds and broken stone paths that crunched under our feet. The air seemed heavier here, and it smelled faintly of damp earth and decay. "We just need to knock on the door and head back," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. But as we moved closer to the porch, the front door, which had been boarded up and shut for years, slowly creaked open, emitting a chilling sound as if it hadn't been touched in a century. The group froze in place, our eyes fixed on the darkness behind the door. And then I saw a figure. It was an old man, wearing a long, dark coat and a battered hat. He stood right in the doorway, leaning on a wooden cane, staring at us with sunken, hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Though he didn't say a word, his gaze seemed to ask, "What are you kids doing here at this hour?"
It's old William.
Mike whispered shakily, his voice barely audible. The old man didn't move. He just stood there, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of the moon. Slowly, he raised one hand and pointed. Not at the ground, not at the house, but directly at us. It felt like an accusation, a warning, or maybe an invitation.
Run!
Jacob suddenly screamed, breaking the spell that held us. Before we could react, he turned and bolted down the path. Instantly, we all followed, our hearts pounding, feet slipping on the overgrown path as we sprinted towards the gate. I felt as if there was an invisible force pulling me back, urging me to stop, to turn around and face the figure at the door. We didn't stop running until we reached the far end of the village. I dared to glance back once, expecting to see old William's shadow chasing us. But the house was dark and silent, as if it had never opened its door, as if no one had ever stood there. Since that night, none of us ever mentioned it again. Yet, every time I passed by that house at night, I always felt a pair of eyes watching me from the darkness. As if old William was still there, waiting for someone brave enough to return. I don't know if he truly wanted us to enter the house, or if it was just a trick of my mind. But one thing I know for sure, I'll never go near that house at night again. People often say that on Halloween night, the boundary between the living and the dead becomes the thinnest. And I know that night, I really did encounter something that didn't belong to this world. It was Halloween night in 2018, my senior year of college in California. I was renting a small apartment in a quiet suburban neighborhood, and that night turned out to be an experience I would never forget. I'm a huge fan of Halloween, and every year I dedicate time to decorating my house for the occasion. But that year, Halloween fell on a weekday, and it happened to be pouring rain. My carefully thought out decoration plans were completely ruined. Frustrated, I decided to skip the decorations altogether, opting instead to sit in my living room with bowls of candy ready for the few brave trick-or-treaters who might venture out in the storm. To pass the time, I put on the movie Insidious, hoping the spooky atmosphere would lift my mood. After about an hour and a half, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my friend Michael in our group chat, asking if anyone was free to come over and hang out for a little impromptu Halloween party. My heart lifted at the idea of some company. It had been a long time since we'd all gotten together, and the prospect of having friends over on such a gloomy night was more than welcome. The others quickly agreed. Sarah, Mary, Chris, and Harry all responded with enthusiasm, and in just 15 minutes, they showed up at my place. They brought along snacks and drinks, and within moments, the house that had felt so dreary just moments before was now filled with laughter, light, and warmth. We spent the next hour or so eating, chatting, and catching up. It was exactly the kind of Halloween evening I'd hoped for. Around midnight, as the conversation began to wind down, Chris leaned forward with a mischievous grin.
Hey, how about we make things a bit more exciting?
He suggested.
Why don't we play a spooky game?
I hesitated. I've always been a bit superstitious, and playing with the supernatural wasn't something I took lightly. But the others seemed excited by the idea. Sarah threw out a few classic suggestions, like Bloody Mary and the Ouija board, but we'd done those in the past. Then, Chris, his grin widening, proposed we play hide and seek in the dark. I had heard of it before. It sounded like a typical hide and seek game, but playing it with the lights off and after midnight gave it a sinister edge. Rumors online spoke of strange sightings, eerie sensations, and encounters with figures that weren't supposed to be there. It was said that when you play in complete darkness, sometimes you aren't alone. I shivered at the thought, but everyone else seemed so excited. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. "Alright, let's do it," I said reluctantly. We agreed to turn off every light in the house, leaving just a single, flickering candle in the living room. The candle cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, adding to the creepy atmosphere. The rules were simple. The seeker would count to 50 in the dark, eyes closed, while everyone else hid anywhere in the house. The first person found would be the next seeker. Sarah volunteered to be it first. She stood in the middle of the living room, covered her eyes, and began to count. The rest of us scattered in silence, doing our best to find the perfect hiding spots. I could hear her counting softly in the background as I slipped into a small closet under the stairs. The cramped space was barely big enough for me, and the darkness felt thick and suffocating. I pressed my back against the wall, listening intently.
48, 49, 50.
Sarah's voice rang out in the darkness.
Ready or not, here I come.
I held my breath, my heart pounding. Footsteps echoed faintly through the house as Sarah moved from room to room. Suddenly, I heard her shout triumphantly, followed by a burst of laughter. She had found Chris hiding behind the living room curtains. I relaxed slightly. It was just a normal game after all. Now it was Chris's turn. I crept out of my hiding spot and quietly made my way to the bathroom in my bedroom. I closed the door gently and crouched down behind the shower curtain. Minutes passed. I could hear Chris's footsteps getting closer and closer. I froze, holding my breath. But then, just as he was about to pass by, a tickle in my throat made me cough loudly. The footsteps stopped.
Gotcha!
Chris called out, his face appearing around the doorframe a moment later. I groaned playfully and joined him back in the living room. Now it was my turn. I stood in the center of the room, closed my eyes, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. As I reached 50, I opened my eyes and looked around. The house was draped in darkness, except for the tiny flame of the candle that flickers uncertainty on the coffee table. Shadows stretched and shrunk with each flicker, giving the room a haunted, almost alive feel. I started my search in the kitchen. Nothing. The bathroom, empty. I then made my way through the bedrooms, my footsteps almost silent on the creaky wooden floor. When I reached my own room, I heard a soft giggle from the closet. I threw the door open and found Mary huddled in the corner. Gotcha. I laughed, and she laughed too, stepping out of her hiding spot.
That was quick.
She teased.
Who else is left?
For more to go, I whispered, signaling for her to join me. We continued our search together, moving quietly through the house. We had almost made it to the top of the stairs when a strange sound came from the storage room downstairs. It was a soft creak, like the sound of a door being gently pushed open. I looked at Mary. Did you hear that? She nodded, wide-eyed. We tiptoed back down the stairs and stopped in front of the small storage room near the living room. The door was slightly open, and darkness poured out like a heavy fog. Maybe Harry or Chris is hiding in there, I whispered. I pushed the door open carefully. The faint candlelight barely reached inside, casting eerie shadows across the stacked boxes and old, forgotten items. I stepped inside cautiously, listening for any hint of movement. There was a faint rustling from the far corner of the room, followed by what sounded like breathing. My heart rate spiked. Just as I took another step forward, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. "Mary," I yelled, panic rising in my chest. There was no answer. Darkness enveloped me completely, and I fumbled around, trying to find the doorknob. But it felt as if it was locked from the outside. Fear clawed at my mind. Then I heard a soft, chilling chuckle. I spun around. In the far corner, barely visible in the dim light, was a figure. Small, hunched over, and staring straight at me. Harry, Chris, I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. Slowly, it began to stand up. It was impossibly tall, thin, and had a grotesque grin stretching from ear to ear. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, fixated on me. I stood frozen, my body refusing to obey as the figure took a step closer. Who are you? I stammered. It didn't respond. Instead, it laughed softly and took another step forward. Panic surged through me. I threw myself at the door, pounding on it desperately. Just as I felt the figure's presence looming over me, the door suddenly flew open. I stumbled out into the living room, gasping for breath. Mary and Harry stared at me, their faces pale. There was someone in the storage room, I shouted. They exchanged confused glances.
No, there's no one there, look.
I turned around, trembling, and looked inside. The room was empty. We checked the entire house, but there was no sign of the figure I had seen. My friends tried to comfort me, saying it must have been my imagination. Maybe it was just a shadow, a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. We decided to end the game and sat in the living room, still shaken. Just as we were starting to calm down, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out and saw a message from an unknown number. The game's over already. Thanks for playing with me. Let's play again soon. I stared in horror, my hands trembling. The others looked up at me, their faces white with fear. A moment later, their phones buzzed too. Each of them had received the same message. I tried to reply, but the messages wouldn't send. We never figured out who sent those messages, and we never played hide and seek in the dark again. Halloween can be a fun night for games, but some games shouldn't be played, especially when you don't know who's really playing with you. I am a single, 22-year-old woman living alone in a small house in a quiet suburb of New York. I moved here about 6 months ago after starting a new job in the city. It's a quaint little neighborhood, lined with old trees that create long shadows on the roads at night. Most of the houses around me are occupied by families, so it felt a bit strange being the only person living alone. During my first few weeks, the house felt empty and unfamiliar, and I often missed the comfort of having my family around. But I kept telling myself that this was my first step towards being independent, and I needed to get used to it. Since Halloween was approaching, I thought it would be a good opportunity to interact with my neighbors and show that I'm friendly. I decided to decorate the front yard to join in the Halloween spirit, and of course, planned to give out candy to the local kids. I thought it would be a good way to feel connected to the community. On the morning of Halloween, I spent hours putting up decorations. I carved pumpkins and placed them along the front steps, their eerie smiles lit up by small candles. I hung fake spider webs around the porch and set up a few scarecrows around the yard. I even dressed up a bit, putting on a festive orange sweater with a big black cat printed on it. By late afternoon, the trick-or-treaters started coming. Groups of children in colorful costumes, along with their parents, knocked on my door, and I happily handed out candy. Many parents stayed for a little chat, and I even learned the names of a few families living nearby, which made me feel a little more at ease. Everything went perfectly well until around 10 p.m. By then, the number of trick-or-treaters had started to dwindle, and most of the porch lights on my street were already turned off. I decided it was time to wrap up. I stood on my porch, looking at the nearly empty candy bowl in my hands, when suddenly I heard the sound of small, shuffling footsteps coming from the street. Then, a soft, whispering voice echoed through the still night.
Trick or treat.
Startled, I looked up and saw a figure standing across the street under the shadow of a tall oak tree. It looked like a child, but the streetlight was too dim to make out any details. I squinted, trying to see more clearly, and noticed that the figure was wearing a strange costume. It had on a tattered, old-fashioned red dress and a plain white mask that covered its entire face. The mask was featureless, no mouth, no nose, just two hollow eye holes.
Come on over.
I called, forcing a smile,
I have some candy left for you.
but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from the darkness with its head slightly tilted. I started to feel a bit uneasy, but I told myself it was probably just a shy kid. After all, it was still Halloween, and maybe they were just nervous to come up to a stranger's house. I took a step forward, hoping to encourage the child to come closer. But as soon as I did, the figure turned abruptly and began walking down the road, disappearing into the shadows cast by the trees. I watched it for a moment, feeling confused. Something about the way it moved seemed strange to smooth, almost gliding along the sidewalk. But I shook my head, thinking I was just letting my imagination run wild. I turned back to my porch, ready to go inside, when I heard it again.
Trick or treat.
This time, the voice was clearer, almost right in front of me. I turned around sharply. The child was back, but now it was standing at the edge of my front yard, right behind the low fence. My heart started pounding. How did it get back so quickly? And why wasn't there any sign of fear or excitement? It just stood there, completely still, watching me. I took a deep breath and stepped off the porch, still holding the bowl of candy.
What kind of candy do you want?
I asked, my voice a bit shaky. The figure didn't respond. It tilted its head to the other side, as if examining me. That's when I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The cloth bag it was holding was empty. A child out trick-or-treating all night without any candy. A cold shiver ran down my spine.
Come on, take some.
I offered, trying to sound calm, even though I felt anything but. The child stepped onto the sidewalk, moving closer. As it approached, I instinctively took a step back. Under the porch light, I could finally see the costume clearly. The red dress was torn and dirty, with dark stains that looked almost like dried blood. I quickly dropped the handful of candy into the bag, but the child didn't react. It just kept staring at me through the mask's empty eye holes. I felt a chill go down my spine.
All right, happy Halloween.
I muttered, backing away and turning to head inside. But just as I reached for the doorknob, I heard soft footsteps behind me. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, and my breath caught in my throat. The child was now standing on my porch, just a few feet away. My hands started trembling.
What do you want?
I whispered, my voice barely audible.
Trick or treat.
The voice was deeper now, almost like an adult's, and it sent a wave of fear through me. Without thinking, I dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I locked it, then pressed my back against it, panting heavily. I looked through the peephole, but the porch was empty. The figure had disappeared again. I thought it was over. But the next night, at exactly the same time, I heard the same voice outside my living room window.
Trick or treat.
I peered through the curtains and felt my blood run cold. The child was back, standing outside, staring in through the glass. The same red dress, the same blank white mask. It didn't move or say anything else, just stood there, waiting. I screamed and called the police. By the time they arrived, the child was gone. They searched the area but found no sign of anyone. The officers told me it was probably just a neighborhood prank, but I knew it wasn't. Now, Halloween is almost here again, and I'm terrified. Will that child come back? Will I have to face those empty eyes once more? I just hope, with everything in me, that I won't hear that chilling whisper outside my window again.